Have you ever seen a wild animal act more human than most humans? Tonight's story will make you question everything you thought you knew about nature. The wind screamed across the frozen landscape of Utqiagvik, Alaska, a place where silence and snow dominate everything, and where even the bravest creatures struggle to survive. Temperatures had dropped below 40 degrees, and the air cut like blades. In the middle of this white desolation stood a solitary wooden cabin, weathered by time and frost. Inside, a small fire cracked in defiance against the storm outside. Sitting by that fire was Mickey, an old Inupiat hunter. His eyes, framed by a face carved with stories and survival, stared into the flames. He wasn't waiting for anyone. No one ever came out here. That's why he lived there. After a lifetime of photographing wild bears, then losing his family to a tragic avalanche 5 years ago, Mickey had chosen solitude over sorrow. But this night, fate had other plans. Suddenly something shifted in the wind. It wasn't just the groan of ice or the whistle of wind slipping through pine. It was deeper. He paused. Then he heard it again. Heavy, rhythmic thuds on the snow, like something large, dragging something. Mickey stood slowly, instinct awake, breath held. He moved to the window, pulling back the frost-covered curtain just enough to see the world outside. What he saw stopped his heart. There, emerging from the dense forest beyond his cabin, was a massive bear. A grizzly, its coat soaked, eyes glinting amber under the moonlight. A predator, yes, but not one acting on instinct. The animal was pulling something, its teeth clamped gently around thick winter clothing, dragging what looked like a limp human body through the snow. Mickey didn't breathe. Years of experience told him this made no sense. Bears don't drag prey like that. Not across flat ground. Not toward human shelter. As the bear drew closer, he could see more clearly. It wasn't carrying prey. It was delivering it. The body, small, frozen, wrapped in scientific thermal gear, was a woman. Her face was pale blue, her lips cracked, blood at her temple. Yet, she moved. Barely, but she moved. Mickey's pulse thundered. The bear reached the edge of the porch, gently let go, and stepped back. Not into attack mode, but almost watching, waiting, as if hoping for help. Mickey couldn't make sense of it. Was this a trick of the mind? A hallucination born from the long, bitter winter? Or was he witnessing a truth too wild for logic? Outside, the snow swirled like spirits. The woman lay motionless. The bear didn't run. Instead, it stood still, chest rising slowly with each breath, staring into Mickey's eyes. And in that moment, that fleeting, impossible second, Mickey felt it. This wasn't just an animal. It was a messenger, a guardian, a soul demanding to be seen. His hands trembled on the doorframe. Was this some kind of Arctic legend come to life? The elders had always said that bears carried the spirits of the old ones, that they were protectors when the line between life and death became too thin. He had never believed them. Not really. Until now. The fire inside the cabin flickered. The storm outside raged harder. But Mickey's world had just fallen completely silent, save for the pounding of his own heart and the impossible truth standing just feet from his door. Who was this woman? How had the bear found her? And why, above all else, why had it brought her to him? The bear let out a single low huff, almost like a breath of relief. Then it turned its head toward the dark woods beyond and paused. Mickey knew the next seconds would change everything. And yet, the decision was his. If you believe animals feel just like us, if you believe they're capable of choices of compassion, then this is the story for you. Subscribe now and follow every step of this journey. You won't want to miss what happens next. Utqiagvik is not a place for the faint-hearted. Once called Barrow, this icy frontier at the edge of the world is home to blinding white plains, biting winds, and an unshakable silence that swallows all sound. The kind of silence that makes you hear your own breath, your own heartbeat, and sometimes something else, something ancient. Here, people don't live with nature. They survive because of it, or not at all. Mickey knew this land better than he knew his own hands. As a child, he had listened to the old ones speak of Nanook, the spirit bear, protector of balance. Not all believed the stories, but Mickey did, especially after the night his father vanished on the ice and was found days later, untouched by the predators that should have devoured him. The bear protected him, they'd whispered. He must have been chosen. That word, chosen, haunted Mickey. What did it mean to be chosen? Why him? He had spent decades chasing that feeling, becoming a wildlife photographer, following bear migrations, living among the creatures that had once seemed like gods. He had seen bears destroy camps, tear into steel containers, swipe at anything that moved, but nothing, absolutely nothing, compared to what he had seen tonight. That bear had not been wild, it had been deliberate. It had chosen to bring a human to safety. To him. Inside the cabin, the firelight flickered across Mickey's wrinkled face as he crouched next to the unconscious woman. He brushed the snow from her hair, revealing bruised skin and a gash along her temple. Her breathing was shallow, lips nearly frozen. She was dressed in Arctic-grade survival gear but soaked through and hypothermic. She needed warmth, fast. Mickey moved into action, heating stones in the fire, wrapping them in seal fur, placing them near her core. It wasn't the first time he'd fought the cold for someone's life, but this time, it was different. This life had been brought to him, delivered like a message, with fur and claws and eyes that had stared into his soul. As he worked, his mind spiraled back to earlier that week. There had been rumors on the shortwave radio, a group of scientists lost during a whiteout, their snowmobiles overturned on a glacier west of town, 3 days without signal, no way to reach them. The last reported name had been a woman, Connick. In Inupiat, it meant snowflake. A chill not caused by the weather ran through his body. He looked at her, still unconscious but slowly breathing, and whispered, "Connick." Outside, the storm roared louder, and then, silence again. Mickey crept to the window. The bear was still there, still watching, still waiting, but not alone. 2 small shadows had joined it, barely visible against the snow. Cubs, frail, trembling, one leaning against the other. It hit Mickey like thunder. This wasn't just a rescue, it was a trade, a pact. The mother bear had brought a human to the only one she could trust. A human who had once spent years in the wild, photographing bears without disturbing them, respecting their space, never exploiting them. She had remembered. She had known. And now, she was asking for help again. Mickey stepped outside, not caring that the cold stabbed at his face, not caring that this could all be a hallucination brought on by age, isolation, or grief. He just knew. The bear didn't flinch, didn't growl. She simply stepped aside, giving space for Mickey to see the cubs clearly. They were thin, limping. One had blood crusted on its fur. Connick wasn't the only one near death. Mickey's throat tightened. How does a bear know to ask for help? How does a creature of the wild, raised with no language, no map, no mercy, know which human will not harm it? He didn't have answers, only instinct. And instinct told him this was more than a rescue. This was a moment that defied logic, biology, even survival. This was faith, raw and silent and snow-covered. He motioned softly. "Come," he whispered. And for the first time in his life, perhaps for the first time in anyone's life, a wild bear listened. She nudged her cubs forward, and then with slow, careful steps she turned and walked back into the forest. She never looked back, but Mickey knew he had just been trusted with something sacred. The door creaked as Mickey stepped back inside, his arms full of trembling life. One cub rested limp against his chest, while the other clung weakly to his coat, its claws barely gripping the rough wool. The warmth of the fire hit them like a wave. The scent of smoke and fur, of snow melting on skin and floorboards, filled the air. He set them gently near the fire, wrapping them in the remaining seal pelts he had used during his own worst winters. They didn't resist. They didn't growl or panic. They simply lay there, shivering, alive, but on the edge. Connick still hadn't opened her eyes, but her breathing had deepened. Her skin, once pale as bone, had taken on a shade of light rose. Mickey knelt beside her again. He placed his palm on her forehead, still cool, but no longer icy. She was stabilizing. He couldn't help glancing toward the door, expecting the bear to return. She didn't. She had done her part. Now it was his turn. The two cubs, so small, so helpless, curled against each other as if trying to remember the heat of their mother's body. One let out a sound, not a growl, not a cry, but something in between. A plea. Mickey felt something crack inside his chest. How could any creature know where to go for help? How could a predator become a protector? He remembered the old hunter's tale his grandmother once told him. A true bear knows the soul of a man before the man knows it himself. At the time, he'd thought it was poetic nonsense. But now, as he wrapped his own parka around two orphaned cubs, it didn't feel like poetry. It felt like truth. The fire hissed and popped. Outside, the wind softened for the first time all night. And then, a sound, not a roar, not a scream, a voice. Soft, raspy. Water. Mickey spun. Connick's lips had moved. He rushed to her side, cradled her head gently, and helped her drink from a cup he'd kept warm by the fire. She coughed once, and then again, and then opened her eyes. They were ice gray, sharp despite the haze of exhaustion. She blinked, trying to focus. "Where?" "You're safe," Mickey said quietly. "Inside. Warm." Her gaze flickered to the cubs, and something changed in her expression. A flicker of awe, maybe fear, maybe disbelief. "The bear," she whispered. He nodded. She brought me here, didn't she?" Mickey didn't answer with words. He just held her gaze. "I wasn't hallucinating," Connick continued. "She was real. She was more than real," he said. "She brought you, and them." Connick sat up slightly, wincing. "She followed me for hours. I thought I was going to die out there. I fell, hit my head. Everything went black, but I remember her. She didn't leave." Mickey stirred the fire, his movements slow and heavy. "She knew where to bring you." Connick looked at him, then around the cabin. Her voice dropped. "Why you?" He didn't respond right away. Instead, he poured more tea. When he finally spoke, his words came like breath. "Maybe because I once watched her kind from a distance and never crossed the line." The cubs let out a tiny cry, pressing their faces deeper into the fur. Connick reached out slowly and placed her hand on the back of the nearest one. It didn't flinch. "They're so small. They're starving," Mickey replied. "She left them with us." "Trust," Connick whispered. "That's what this is. She trusted us." The cabin, though barely larger than a single room, felt filled with something vast, something sacred. For the next few hours, neither of them spoke much. They worked, heating broth, cutting soft fish for the cubs, checking Connick's injuries. Mickey offered her his own bedroll. He would sleep by the fire, but sleep didn't come, because every time he closed his eyes, he saw the bear, her breath visible in the freezing air, her massive frame disappearing into the storm and not returning. He wondered if she was out there watching still, or if she had gone off to die alone, her final act, one of impossible sacrifice. By morning, the wind had stopped. The sky glowed a soft blue-gray as daylight tried to break through the clouds. Connick stood with help, gazing out the tiny, frost-rimmed window. The cubs slept beside the hearth, warm and still. "I was out on the glacier," she said, breaking the silence. "Doing wildlife tracking. We got separated in the storm. I walked for hours. Days, maybe. I couldn't tell. I saw her watching me, always just behind, like a shadow." "She wasn't hunting you?" "No," Connick said. "She was guiding me." Mickey exhaled slowly. Neither of them said what they were both thinking. This wasn't science, this was something else. Something older. Something sacred. The bear had made a choice. Against every instinct, every rule of survival. She had acted with purpose. Not as predator, not as beast, but as guardian. And now, in this small wooden shelter at the edge of the world, Her legacy lay sleeping by the fire. Mickey stood behind Connick, watching her silhouette against the pale light. Her hand rested on the window frame, trembling slightly from exhaustion, but her voice carried strength. "I keep wondering," she said. "What made her do it? Why save me? Why not leave me to die, like any wild animal would?" He didn't have the answer. No one would. But something inside him stirred. Not logic, not knowledge, just a quiet certainty. Some things aren't meant to be explained. Some are only meant to be honored. The cubs stirred beside the fire, letting out soft, breathy sounds as they snuggled deeper into the warmth. Their fur was still damp, their ribs still too visible. Mickey knelt beside them, gently adjusting the blankets. He could feel their tiny hearts beating beneath his fingers. "She trusted you," Connick said behind him. "And now she's gone." Her words hung in the air like smoke. Mickey didn't respond. He simply ran a hand over one cub's back, slow and steady. The memory of the bear's eyes returned, that stare across the snow, full of knowing. Not fear, not dominance. Something else, something deeply human. The kind of gaze that demands responsibility. The weight of it settled on his shoulders. Connick moved carefully back to the bed, wincing as she sat. "They won't survive out there without her." "I know," Mickey murmured. They spent the morning tending to the cubs. Broth, warmth, quiet movements, no sudden noises, no harsh light. The fire became the center of their world, not just for heat, but for calm, for rhythm, life in its rawest form. And then, as Connick drifted into sleep again, a strange silence fell over the cabin. The kind that isn't empty but charged, as if the world were holding its breath. Mickey stepped outside. The air was still. No wind, no sound, just the soft crunch of snow under his boots. He walked a few paces from the cabin, his eyes scanning the tree line. No movement, no shadow, no returning bear. Only vast, endless white. He looked down. Tracks. Her tracks. They led back toward the forest. Wide, deliberate. They hadn't been blown away by the wind. She had walked away slowly, willingly. She had never planned to come back. His chest tightened. He followed the tracks for several meters, then stopped. The forest loomed ahead, quiet and cold, ancient in its stillness. He closed his eyes and inhaled deeply, the air cutting into his lungs. "What would you have me do now?" he whispered into the silence. And somehow, it felt like the forest answered, not with sound, but with memory. Her eyes again. Her gift. Her final request. When he returned to the cabin, Connick was awake again, sitting up against the wall, the blanket pulled around her shoulders. She looked at him, eyes red-rimmed, but clear. "She's not coming back, is she?" "No," Mickey said. "She's done her part." Connick looked at the cubs, still asleep beside the fire. "Then we do ours." He nodded. There was no turning back now, not emotionally, not morally. This wasn't just about two bear cubs. This was about something deeper, a bridge that had been built in the most impossible of ways. A bridge made of trust, of sacrifice, of instinct that ran deeper than blood. As they tended to the cubs again, Mickey caught himself watching Connick closely. Despite her pain, her body bruised and frostbitten, there was a quiet strength in her movements, the kind that comes only after a person has faced death and been chosen to return. She caught his look and gave a faint smile. "I think we've been given a second chance, all of us." He didn't smile back. Not yet. But he nodded, because she was right. And now, they had a duty. To each other, to these cubs, to the one who had walked away into the storm so they could live. Mickey glanced out the window again, toward the forest's edge. He didn't expect to see her. He didn't need to. Somewhere, deep inside, he knew. She had found her place to rest. And he had just found his reason to stay alive. The days that followed moved slowly, wrapped in the quiet rhythm of survival. The snow outside never fully stopped, only softened into a fine dust that coated everything in silence. Inside the cabin, the fire became more than warmth. It became their anchor, their heartbeat. The cubs began to recover, their breathing stronger, their movement steadier. They began to lift their heads, sniff the air, shift toward the warmth of Mickey's touch. One even let out a soft chuff when Connick brought a bowl of fish near. It was the first sound of life either of them had made since arriving. Connick moved with a limp but insisted on helping. She had grown quieter, more reflective. Her scientific mind, once trained to measure and calculate, seemed to step aside for something else. She no longer spoke of biology or probability. Instead, she sat with the cubs, her hands gentle, her eyes watching, as if learning a language older than her own. At night, they would sit by the fire. Mickey rarely spoke unless it was necessary. Connick would sometimes whisper memories of her team, of the storm, of the long, cold walk she couldn't remember but still felt in her bones. She never asked where the bear had gone, neither did he. One evening, as the last light faded into the horizon, one of the cubs struggled to its feet. Wobbling, determined, it crossed the wooden floor and pressed its nose to Mickey's knee. He froze. The cub stared up at him, small and trembling, and then laid its head on his leg. He didn't move for a long time. The next morning, Connick found him outside at dawn, staring into the trees. She said nothing, just stood beside him. The air was still, the sky pale. Somewhere out there, the forest kept its secrets, and they had become part of them. Later, they set up a sleeping corner for the cubs closer to the stove. Mickey built a low wooden barrier, more to define space than to contain them. The cubs were growing more curious, more alert. One began to explore the corners of the room, nudging boots, sniffing at baskets of dried roots. The other followed, slower, still weaker, but no longer on the edge of death. That night, as Connick cleaned a bowl, she asked, "Do you think she knew we'd take care of them?" Mickey nodded. She didn't guess. She remembered. He didn't elaborate. He didn't have to. Some years ago, in the middle of a migration, he had sat for 5 days watching a grizzly family from a ridge. He'd kept his distance, never interfered. And he'd seen something in the mother's eyes then. Something he saw again days ago in the snow. Recognition. Trust was earned in silence, in presence. The cabin, once a place of retreat and forgetting, had become something new. A sanctuary, not just from the cold, but from the world. From disbelief. From everything that said such things couldn't happen. One of the cubs began making a small huffing sound when Mickey entered the room. Not a warning. Not fear. Something softer. Familiar. He didn't respond with words, only movement. Slow, calm, deliberate. The language of respect. As the week ended, the storm finally broke. The skies cleared. Blue bled into white, and the land glistened in light. Mickey opened the door wide, letting the air cleanse the cabin. The cubs stared out, blinking against the sun as if seeing the world for the first time. Connick stood beside them, her hands resting on their backs. The moment was still. "They'll have to go back someday," she said. "Yes," Mickey replied. "But not yet." She turned toward him. "And you? Will you ever go back?" He looked out at the forest, then at the cubs, then at her. His voice was low. "I never left." They remained there at the threshold of the cabin, where warmth met cold and time seemed to hesitate. The cubs sniffed the wind, ears flicking toward distant sounds carried across the frozen landscape. Their bodies leaned gently into the comfort of the two humans who had become their world. Later that day, Mickey and Connick began building a small shelter beside the cabin. A space for the cubs to stretch, climb, explore without being exposed to the full force of the Arctic. They worked slowly, carefully, using wood Mickey had once stored for repairs he never made. The work warmed them. It gave purpose, the kind that lingered long after movement stopped. The cubs followed their progress with lazy interest, curling near the fire when tired, wandering outside when curious. It was during one of those moments that Mickey noticed a set of tracks in the snow leading to the edge of the woods and back again. Fresh. Large. He didn't speak of it, but he watched more closely. That night Connick dreamed of soft fur and yellow eyes watching her through branches. When she awoke, she said nothing either. Some things are not meant to be explained, only felt. The next few days passed with quiet intention. The cubs grew stronger. One began climbing over the firewood stack, tumbling awkwardly and getting back up again. The other preferred to stay close to the humans, especially Mickey, trailing behind him like a quiet shadow. Their personalities were forming, different but bonded. Brothers, perhaps, or twins. Connick had no way of knowing, but it didn't matter. Each evening they gathered by the fire, the same rhythm, silence, breath, the occasional rustle of fur or movement from one of the cubs. Outside, the wind had softened. The forest had stopped whispering. Then came the morning that changed everything. Mickey stepped outside at dawn, a mug of hot tea in his hand. The air was still, the light soft and golden, dusting the snow with warmth. At the edge of the trees he saw her, the bear, standing tall and unmoving, her shape barely visible in the shadows of the spruce. She did not come closer. She did not make a sound. She only watched. Mickey lowered his mug slowly. His breath fogged the air. Behind him the door creaked. Connick joined him, squinting into the trees. She saw her too. For a long time none of them moved. Then the bear gave a small nod of her head. Not human, not rehearsed, but something ancient. A gesture, a farewell. Then she turned and disappeared into the woods. They didn't see her again. The cubs stirred inside, restless, as if they knew something had changed, that whatever bond had brought them here had shifted. The last thread had loosened. Mickey didn't speak for hours. He spent the day mending a net, watching the trees with soft eyes. Connick wrote in her journal, though the words came slowly. Her hands kept returning to the same line again and again. She didn't abandon them. She trusted us. That evening, Mickey finally broke the silence. We'll need to start preparing them. For the wild? For everything. Connick nodded. And so, the next chapter began. Not with dramatic farewells or sudden change, but with gentle, deliberate steps. They walked the cubs to the tree line, let them sniff, explore, then returned. Day after day. Longer distances. More freedom. Less control. The bond didn't weaken, it deepened. Not as dependence, but as recognition. A memory being formed. That not all humans destroy. That some give back. That sometimes the forest sends its own messengers, and the only thing asked of us is to listen. The days began to stretch longer, touched by the return of light. The snow, though still thick and cold, sparkled with early signs of spring. The forest beyond the cabin no longer loomed like a wall of shadows, but breathed with quiet life. Birds returned in soft calls. The wind no longer screamed but hummed gently through the trees. The cubs responded to the change. They grew braver, wandering farther from the cabin, yet always returning before dusk. One afternoon they chased each other around the woodpile, tumbling and rolling like children. Mickey stood watching them, arms crossed, his lips twitching toward a rare smile. Inside, Connick stirred a pot over the fire, glancing at them through the window. Her journal lay open beside her, pages filled with drawings, fragments of memory, observations written not as a scientist, but as someone who had been forever changed. That evening, as the sky turned gold and lavender, the four of them sat near the fire. The cubs lay curled together, their bellies full, their fur thick and soft again. Connick rested her head against the log wall, her eyes reflecting the flames. Mickey sat with his knees pulled close, carving a smooth stone in silence. She looked over at him. You ever name them? He paused, the blade hovering. Didn't seem right. She nodded. I've been calling the smaller one Aput. Snow. The way he follows your footsteps. Mickey chuckled low in his throat. And the bigger one? She smiled. Tuktu. Strong and stubborn. He looked at the cubs. It fits. The fire crackled. Connick's voice softened. Do you think she's still watching? She doesn't have to, Mickey said. She knows. The cubs stirred, one stretching a paw across the other. Mickey reached out slowly, letting his fingers rest against the edge of Aput's back. The cub didn't flinch, only breathed deeper. It wasn't ownership, it was presence. Recognition. Moments like that made time dissolve. The harshness of the past winter, the danger, the fear, it all faded into something still, like a quiet song only heard when everything else stops. If this act of compassion moved you, Connick whispered. Not to Mickey, but to the air, as if the world might be listening. Show your support, like they showed theirs. The flames danced. Outside, stars blinked awake in the darkening sky. The forest stood silent, not in threat, but in witness. Later that night, Mickey stood outside once more, arms folded, breath steady. The cold touched his skin, but no longer bit. He looked toward the trees, not searching, not expecting, just honoring. Behind him, the cubs slept without fear. Inside, Connick closed her journal and laid it beside her heart. There were no more questions to ask, only stories left to live. The following morning arrived with stillness, no wind, no clouds. Just light, pure and clear, stretching across the snow like a blessing. Mickey moved quietly, not wanting to wake the cubs who had curled into one another beside the fire. Connick was already awake, standing outside in the soft glow, her arms wrapped around herself, watching the tree line. He stepped up beside her. For a while, neither spoke. The forest was wide and endless, but it no longer felt empty. They'll leave one day, she said softly. Won't they? Mickey nodded. When they're ready. And us? She asked, her voice almost lost in the light breeze. He didn't answer immediately. The question didn't need an answer. It was already happening. Every step forward, every time they let the cubs walk farther without following, every night they didn't call them back, it was all part of letting go. That afternoon, they hiked together with the cubs down a narrow path through the trees. It had once been a trail for caribou, barely visible now, but known to Mickey's memory. He showed Connick where to walk, how to listen to the snow beneath her boots, how to read the silence. The cubs ran ahead at times, stopping to wait, looking back with wide, dark eyes. They climbed over fallen branches, dug at the base of trees, tasted the air like they were learning it for the first time. There was something sacred in their movement, not wild yet, but no longer dependent. When they returned to the cabin, Connick sat on the steps for a long time, watching them. Her eyes followed every movement as if memorizing their shapes. That night she cooked, real food. Her hands had regained strength. She moved with purpose again, not just healing, but rebuilding. When they sat down to eat, the cubs rested quietly, exhausted from the long walk. Mickey lifted his bowl, eyes on the firelight flickering across the wooden walls. They're learning, he said. So are we, she replied. He looked at her and found no hesitation in her gaze, only calm. The next few days followed that rhythm. Mickey taught the cubs the scent of fish under snow, how to paw gently without scaring prey. Connick taught them to trust new sounds, to approach without fear. Their confidence grew. So did the space they claimed. On the 10th morning since the bears returned to the forest, a poot didn't come back when called. Mickey waited. Connick waited. Hours passed. Then just as the sun began to lower behind the hills, he appeared, with a fish in his mouth clutched tightly and proudly. He dropped it at the doorway, nudged it forward, then looked up. Connick knelt slowly, voice caught in her throat. He did it. Mickey didn't speak. He only nodded once, his eyes wet but steady. That evening, they didn't cook. They let the cubs sleep with full bellies and dirt on their paws. They let the fire die slower than usual, the silence filling the room with something vast and unspoken. Mickey sat with his back to the wall, carving a new piece of driftwood, his hands moving without thinking. Connick wrote by candlelight. Her final sentence filled the page. They came here as cubs. They'll leave as bears. She closed the journal and placed it gently on the windowsill. Outside, the stars were gathering. The stars shimmered above the treetops like whispers of something ancient, something watching. Mickey stood at the threshold of the cabin, arms crossed over his chest, breath soft and slow. Behind him, the cubs slept in a tangle of limbs and fur. Connick had fallen asleep with her head resting on her arm, her journal still open beside her. The night was calm. No sounds came from the woods, only the occasional creak of trees shifting under the cooling air. At dawn, the cubs were already awake, pacing near the door, not frantic, not impatient, just ready. Mickey opened the door and stepped aside. They didn't hesitate. Tuktu moved first, his steps light but sure, his head held higher than ever before. Aput followed, stopping for a moment to look back at Mickey. Their eyes met, and for that single held breath of time, everything stilled. Then he turned and walked into the forest. Kanak stood behind Mickey watching them go, one hand resting gently on the doorframe. Neither of them said anything. The snow crunched under small paws, then faded. The trees swallowed the shapes. The silence returned. Mickey didn't close the door. They spent that day in a quiet rhythm. No one spoke of the goodbye. The fire was kept small. Kanak cleaned the table. Mickey sharpened his knives. The journal remained on the sill, untouched. By evening, the forest felt distant again. Still familiar, but changed. The next morning, Mickey checked the edge of the woods. No tracks, no sounds, no shapes moving through the snow. Only the wind, brushing softly through the pine. He turned back, eyes scanning the sky as if waiting for a sign he didn't need. Inside, Kanak was packing her things. Her strength had returned fully. Her eyes were clear. She had written everything she needed to. Now she was ready to carry it forward. She looked at Mickey as he entered. "I'll head back tomorrow." He nodded. That night they sat in silence. The fire burned low. No cubs at their feet. No sound except the wood cracking softly beneath the flame. When Kanak stood to sleep, she turned to him once more. "They'll remember us." "They won't need to," Mickey said. "That's how we'll know we did it right." She gave a small smile and disappeared behind the curtain. Mickey stayed up longer, watching the flames die down to embers. When the last light flickered out, he sat in the dark a little while longer, listening to nothing. And in that silence, he felt peace. The morning came with a sky painted in soft gold and pale blue, the kind of light that feels like a beginning. Kanak stood at the edge of the cabin, her bag slung over one shoulder, boots laced tight. Mickey stood a few feet away, arms folded, face unreadable. She looked toward the trail leading back to the distant town, the world she had left behind, the one waiting to hear her story. But now it didn't feel like the world she belonged to. Not entirely. "I'll send word when I arrive," she said. Mickey nodded once. "You'll need to tell it right." "I will." She hesitated, then stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him. His arms came up slowly, then settled on her back, solid and certain. "You changed everything," she said against his shoulder. "So did you." She pulled back, her eyes bright. "I don't think this was just a story. I think it was a message." Mickey looked past her toward the trees. "Then go share it." She turned, adjusted the strap of her bag and began walking. The snow crunched under her boots, fading with each step. She didn't look back. He didn't follow. Instead, he returned to the cabin and lit the fire. The room felt larger now, emptier, but not in a lonely way, in a finished way. Like a chapter had been read to its last line, and the page turned gently without regret. Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, Mickey sat by the window with a small wooden figure in his hand. He turned it slowly between his fingers, a carving of a bear, rough but full of life. Beside it lay two smaller ones side by side. He placed them gently on the windowsill. The forest stretched quiet and deep beyond the glass. Then, from far off, a sound echoed through the trees. Not close, not loud, just enough. A long, low call. Steady, familiar. Mickey closed his eyes and smiled. The sound faded slowly, swallowed by distance and pine. Mickey remained at the window, unmoving, as the night folded itself around the cabin. The fire behind him crackled softly, casting shadows that danced across the walls, flickering over the three carved bears resting on the sill. He didn't need to see them to know they were out there. Somewhere in the vastness of the forest, the cubs were growing stronger, climbing trees, learning the language of snow, following the echoes of instincts awakened beneath the shelter of a human roof. They would forget the fire's warmth. They would forget the softness of blankets and the hands that fed them. But something would stay. Not memory, not recognition, but the shape of a feeling. Safety, maybe. Trust. Mickey stood and walked to the door. He opened it slowly, stepping out into the cool night air. The stars blinked above like scattered embers, cold and bright. The forest stood in perfect stillness, but it didn't feel empty. He breathed deeply, the scent of pine and cold soil grounding him. This was not the end of the story. He had no words for what it had been. Not miracle, not myth, just truth. A truth too quiet for headlines and too deep for explanation. Something that had passed through his life like a shadow of light, changing nothing and everything. He turned and looked back at the cabin. Smoke curled from the chimney. The wooden walls glowed faintly with firelight. The home he had once filled with silence now held echoes of new life, of healing, of something ancient choosing him, and him choosing back. He walked down the steps and onto the snow, standing where the cubs had once stood. The prints had long been blown away, but he saw them still. He didn't need more signs, just the night, the breath in his chest, and the knowledge that somewhere beyond the trees, the ones who had come in need had left whole. He stayed there for a while, under the open sky, until the cold reached through his coat and the fire inside began to call him back. Then he turned, stepped inside, and closed the door. The door closed with a quiet thud behind him, sealing the warmth of the cabin back into its walls. Mickey stood for a moment, letting the silence settle once more. The fire had burned low, its light reduced to glowing embers. He moved toward it, kneeling down, adding wood with slow, deliberate hands. The flames caught, rising gently, casting orange ribbons along the floor. He didn't speak. There was no one left to speak to, but he didn't feel alone. The cabin had changed. Not in shape, but in energy. It no longer carried only the weight of old grief, but something lighter, something alive. It held the memory of breath shared between species, of quiet trust, of unspoken understanding between beings separated by language but bound by instinct. Mickey sat beside the fire, his knees pulled up, arms resting across them. He looked again at the windowsill, the carved bear, the two small ones beside it. Their shadows stretched along the wood like echoes of the ones that had come and gone. He thought of Connick, already far down the trail by now, perhaps at the edge of town, surrounded by noise again. Lights, people, movement. She would tell the story, he knew, and others would listen. Some would doubt. Others would reduce it to luck, coincidence, desperation. He didn't mind. She had seen it, lived it. That was enough. The wind picked up outside, brushing lightly against the walls. He listened to it, not for signs or sounds or footsteps, just listened, the way one listens to the breath of someone sleeping nearby. He stood once more, walked to the table, and picked up a piece of folded parchment. Connick had left it without saying anything, tucked under the edge of the carving. He unfolded it slowly. There were no long words, just a single line written in her hand. Some stories don't need endings, only witnesses. He stared at it for a long time. Then he folded it again and placed it beneath the carved figures, anchoring it in place. The fire cracked louder now, rising with confidence. He let it burn, watched the flames dance, and sat back down. Outside, the forest breathed. Inside, he did too. The night deepened, wrapping the cabin in velvet stillness. The embers pulsed with a steady rhythm, the only light left to soften the dark. Mickey leaned back against the wall, the heat from the hearth warming one side of his face, the other cooled by the air that slipped in through the old wood panels. He closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to remember. The weight of the cub in his arms, the bear's breath in the snow, Connick's voice barely more than a whisper asking if she was alive, the sound of small paws across the floor, the quiet moment when instinct had become trust. Each memory passed through him like smoke, brief, real, then gone. Somewhere, far from the reach of human sound, the cubs were learning the feel of bark beneath their claws, the weight of silence before a pounce, the depth of rivers when crossing. Their world had opened wild and sharp. They would become what they were meant to be, unbound. And he, too, had returned to what he was. Not just a man in a cabin, but part of something larger. When the fire began to settle into coals again, he rose and walked to the back of the room. He reached for a woven blanket draped over a wooden chest, one his mother had made decades ago, before time began to slow. He wrapped it around his shoulders and stepped once more to the door. The stars waited. The snow held its hush. He opened the door and stepped outside, bare feet pressing gently into the frost. The cold bit quick, but he didn't flinch. He looked toward the forest, not seeking, just acknowledging. His breath rose in clouds. The world offered no answer, but in the quiet, he felt a rhythm, slow, ancient, and steady, as if the ground itself remembered the story now buried in its snow. He stood there until the sky turned pale again, until light returned without warning, as it always did. Then he turned back inside, not to retreat, but to continue. The light spilled gently over the trees, brushing the tops of the pines in soft gold. Mickey stepped back into the cabin, the warmth embracing him like something familiar. He closed the door behind him and shed the blanket, hanging it over the hook beside the stove. The fire had died down again, but the coals glowed enough to keep the chill at bay. He brewed tea in silence, the old kettle hissing as it heated. The scent of pine needles and dried berries filled the small room. He poured a cup and sat at the table, cradling it in both hands, feeling the heat seep into his skin. The carvings on the sill caught the first rays of sun. He looked at them, the large bear, the two smaller ones, and reached into the drawer beneath the table. He pulled out his carving knife and a block of wood and began to shape something new. Each stroke was careful, each curl of wood falling to the floor like snow. This one would be smaller. Not a bear. Something else. He worked until midday, pausing only to stoke the fire, sip his tea, and glance out the window now and then. There were no figures in the snow, no paw prints, no echoes of what had passed. But that was not a loss. It was the nature of wild things to leave quietly. By late afternoon, the carving took form. A human figure sitting cross-legged, hands resting on its knees. No detail in the face, just presence. A witness. He placed it beside the bears, forming a silent circle. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of distant earth and ice. It rattled the edges of the window panes, then passed. Mickey stood and stretched, joints clicking softly in the quiet. He opened the door again, stepping outside without hesitation. The forest greeted him with the same stillness as before, but now it felt like an old friend, the kind that doesn't need words to understand what's been shared. He watched the sky shift from pale blue to dusk, watched a bird cut across the treetops, watched nothing at all for a long time. Then he turned toward the trees and spoke, his voice low, steady. "Where in the world are you hearing this story from?" The wind didn't answer, but the forest listened. The wind moved gently through the trees, lifting the tips of the pines and carrying with it the last traces of winter. Mickey stood still at the edge of the clearing, eyes on the distant horizon. The forest, unchanged and yet different, pulsed with quiet life. Not all stories needed echoes. Some lived on in the silence they left behind. He turned back toward the cabin, footsteps slow but grounded. Inside, the light was soft, filtered through the smoke-streaked windows. The carvings sat where he had left them. The fire was low but alive, and the air held the weight of memory. Mickey poured the last of the tea, sat at the table, and looked out through the frost-trimmed glass. There was no movement, no shadows at the tree line, and still the space felt full. He reached for the journal Connick had left, now resting between the bear carvings. Her handwriting filled the pages in steady strokes, a record of the days, the choices, the unexplainable truths they had witnessed. He turned to the final page and read it again. Some stories don't need endings, only witnesses. He closed the cover gently, placed it beside the carved figure of the human seated in stillness, and leaned back in his chair. The fire crackled once, as if in quiet agreement. Outside, the light began to shift. Long shadows stretched across the snow. Soon, night would come again, and with it the possibility of soundless footsteps beyond the trees. He didn't need to see them. The knowing was enough. As the last light faded from the window, he rose and walked once more to the door. This time, he left it open. He stood there in the fading light, one hand resting against the frame, the other tucked into the pocket of his coat, And though the wind was cold, it didn't touch him the same way it used to. Not since that night. Not since she came. Not since they left. In the silence, he whispered to the air, not for himself, but for whoever might be listening now. If this story meant something to you, if it made you feel something real, don't let it end here. His voice was low, steady. Subscribe to the channel. There are more stories waiting, more truths in the wild. And the next one, it's already on its way. He stepped back inside. The fire welcomed him. Behind him, the door stayed open just a little longer, as if inviting the night to listen too. Then, as the screen of time faded to black, one final echo lingered. Click on the next video appearing now. The story continues there. The flame flickered once more, and the forest kept watch.